The first thing Jonathan noticed wasn't the marble floors or the glass walls stretching toward the Manhattan skyline. It was the way his shoes squeaked against the polished surface loud enough to expose him. He had polished them the night before with a paper towel and a few drops of cooking oil because he couldn't afford real polish. His palms were sweating through the thin folder that held his resume, and his heart thudded so violently he wondered if the receptionist could hear it from across the lobby. He was only looking for a job, any job. But somehow he had stepped into a world that didn't look like it was built for men like him. What would you have done if you were him? If your daughter's school had just sent a final warning about unpaid tuition? If your landlord had taped an eviction notice to your door? If your refrigerator held nothing but a half carton of milk and fading hope? Would you have turned around and walked out the second you realized you were in the wrong place? Or would desperation have pushed you forward the way it pushed Jonathan that morning? He had meant to walk into a small staffing agency 2 buildings down instead. Distracted by a call from his babysitter saying his 7-year-old daughter Sophie had a fever, he entered the towering headquarters of Carter Industries. He realized his mistake only after he gave his name at the front desk and the receptionist glanced at a tablet, nodded and told him to take the elevator to the top floor. He tried to explain, but she had already moved on to the next person. For a man who had spent the last year being told no, the word yes, even if accidental, felt like a door opening. Jonathan had once been a construction foreman in Ohio before his wife Megan got sick. Hospital bills devoured their savings. The treatments drained more than money. They drained light from her eyes until one winter morning. He held her hand in a sterile hospital room and promised her he would take care of Sophie no matter what. After the funeral, the company downsized. Jonathan lost his job. The months that followed were a blur of rejection emails, late notices, and quiet tears he tried to hide from his daughter. Moving to New York had been his last gamble, a chance at bigger opportunities. But opportunity had felt like a myth ever since. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped into a private office flooded with afternoon sun. A woman stood near the window, her posture straight, her presence commanding yet tired in a way that no makeup could conceal. Her name was Victoria Carter, the CEO, whose face had appeared on magazine covers and business news segments. She turned slowly, studying him with eyes that seemed to measure more than just qualifications. He began apologizing immediately, explaining that he must have been mistaken for someone else, that he was just looking for work. But she didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her gaze softening as he mentioned Sophie and the fever and the eviction notice he hadn't meant to confess. It was as if something in his honesty cut through the sterile air of that office. Victoria's life, though gilded, had cracks invisible to the world. Her father had built the company and when he died suddenly the board questioned her capability. Investors whispered doubts. Tabloids speculated about her single status as if it were a flaw in her leadership. The board had recently suggested that stability in her personal life might calm shareholder anxiety. A husband, they implied, would make her appear grounded, traditional, safe. She despised the idea of marrying for optics. Yet the pressure weighed heavily. When Jonathan stood there, vulnerable and unpolished, he was the opposite of every calculated suitor she had met. He was real. What if someone offered you security in exchange for your pride? What if the line between survival and self-respect blurred until you couldn't tell which side you stood on? Victoria proposed something that made Jonathan's breath catch. She needed a husband not for love, not yet, but for partnership, a contract marriage that would satisfy the board and protect her control of the company. In return, she would provide him a salary far beyond what he had hoped for, a home, health insurance for Sophie, stability. It sounded absurd, almost cruel. Yet, there was no mockery in her expression, only a strange sincerity and a quiet plea of her own. Jonathan thought of Megan's last words of Sophie's thin arms around his neck when she asked if they were going to be okay. He thought about the shame he felt needing help. But he also thought about the promise he had made. He asked for one night to decide. That evening, he sat beside Sophie's bed in their tiny apartment, listening to her uneven breathing as she slept through her fever. The eviction notice lay folded on the kitchen counter. He realized that pride would not keep his daughter warm. Love would, and sometimes love demanded choices that felt impossible. The wedding was small and discreet, held in a quiet chapel in Brooklyn with only a handful of executives as witnesses. Jonathan wore a tailored suit provided by Victoria's assistant, and Sophie clutched a small bouquet, smiling shyly. The media called it a whirlwind romance. They didn't know about the contract signed in a conference room or the clauses outlining public appearances and private boundaries. At first, their home felt like a museum Jonathan was afraid to touch. He worried about saying the wrong thing at charity galas, about embarrassing her in front of investors. Victoria in turn struggled with letting anyone see her unguarded. They were two strangers bound by necessity, walking carefully around each other's pain. But life has a way of dissolving walls in unexpected moments. It happened on a night when Sophie had a nightmare and wandered into Victoria's study. Jonathan found them on the couch, Victoria awkwardly stroking Sophie's hair, whispering reassurances she must have once wished someone would whisper to her. Something shifted. And the arrangement began to feel less like a transaction and more like a fragile beginning. Victoria saw how Jonathan woke early to make Sophie breakfast before school, how he insisted on attending every parent-teacher meeting despite his new social obligations. Jonathan saw how Victoria stayed up late reviewing reports, the weight of thousands of employees resting on her shoulders. They began sharing pieces of themselves, stories of childhood, of fears, of loneliness. The contract remained, but it grew irrelevant. Months later, when a major investor threatened to pull funding unless Victoria made more strategic personal choices, Jonathan stood beside her at a press conference. He spoke not as a hired husband, but as a man who believed in her vision and her strength. His sincerity disarmed critics. Share prices stabilized. The board quieted. Love did not arrive like fireworks. It arrived quietly like spring after a brutal winter. It showed itself in shared laughter over burnt pancakes, in late-night conversations on the balcony overlooking the city, in the way Victoria began reaching for Jonathan's hand without thinking. One evening, long after the contract's expiration date had passed, she found it tucked in a drawer and tore it in half. Jonathan realized that he had walked into the wrong building that desperate morning, but perhaps he had stepped into the right life. He was no longer just a poor single dad searching for work. He was a partner, a father whose daughter now had 2 arms to run into after school. A man who had learned that dignity is not lost in accepting help when the intention is pure. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments what you would have chosen in Jonathan's place. And if this story truly touched your heart, gently reminding you that second chances can arrive in the most unexpected places, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Kind Soul Stories so more people can believe in the quiet miracles that happen when kindness meets courage.